to speak tonight. And Joan, I had the opportunity to hear you speak once before and I missed it. I actually worked at a local bookstore that you did an event at that I helped set up for, but then couldn't stay for. So I'm very excited to hear you speak tonight. So for anyone in the audience who hasn't heard of her before or doesn't know her accomplishments, Joan Malouf is a writer, an ecologist, and a conservationist with a unique voice in today's times.
Okay, thank you. It's wonderful to see all your faces, and some people, I know your names, but I haven't seen your faces before. So this is wonderful for me, and thank you for all that you're doing, because we need every single one of the activists out there right now. So thank you. My presentation is going to be fairly brief tonight because I was told I had 20 to 25 minutes. So I appreciate you giving me this opportunity. I'm going to go right ahead and share my screen. Don't want that to be shared. There we go. Okay, so the can everyone see my screen? Good. Tonight I'm going to talk about recent scientific evidence linking old growth forests with carbon uptake. And notice this is scientific evidence, because we can all have an opinion about things, but as a scientist myself, I like to lean on the actual evidence and the papers, the numbers, if you will. So this is an image of me in 1989 when I was working on my master's degree, and I was measuring the carbon uptake in plants. So I had a leaf clamped into that clear plexiglass chamber, and I'm looking down at this machine that's reading out the carbon dioxide level in that clear device. And I could see that those numbers were dropping because that plant was taking that carbon dioxide into itself. And this made this carbon in the atmosphere, which we can't smell and we can't see, very real for me. And at that time in 1989, the atmosphere had 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide. And now that number is around 414. Excuse me, I have to figure out how to advance the slide. There we go. So exactly when I had that leaf clamped in there and that carbon dioxide was disappearing, where exactly was it going? Well, it was going into these little pores in the leaves called stomata. And then from there, it actually enters the cell and becomes part of the process of photosynthesis, becomes a larger molecule like a sugar, eventually a starch. And this process and what plants do is very substantial. 40% of the atmospheric carbon goes into through these stomata in a year, and over half of the water circulating in the atmosphere. So we're not talking about 1 or 2%. We're talking about half of the water, 40% of the carbon. Once the carbon goes into the plant, then what happens to it? Well, some of it is used for respiration, which is the energy that the plant needs to live on, same way that we need to eat because we need energy to live on. Plants do too. But then plants can also store the excess for their growth. And a lot of it will go into the trunks and the branches, about 40%, some in the leaves, some in the roots. But look at this number here, the largest on this graph, 45% goes down into the soil organic matter. And we're really just beginning to understand this better. So some of that soil organic matter would be tree roots that have died. Some of it is organisms, those microorganisms that live in the soil that feed off the tree roots, and they contain carbon. So the carbon can move from the roots into these organisms. And some of it is just the organic matter in the soil itself. But the soil is a very important store for the carbon that goes into the plant. And as I just mentioned, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increasing. Okay, you have to be living in a cave not to know that. So if you can see this line here and going straight up, that's our CO2 graph. And these orange ones are from the Mauna Loa data that's taken in Hawaii. But then look at this line here. At the same time that carbon dioxide is increasing, the global forest cover is decreasing. And it's been decreasing since this, well, for the past 5,000 years, the global forest cover has been decreasing because of anthropogenic effects. So we are burning the fossil fuels, and that's adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, of course, but then the forests are removing some of that because that's what they do. We just talked about that. But then as this is going on, we're burning the fossil fuels, putting the CO2 out there. The forests are doing their best to take it in, but then we cut down the forests, and some of the carbon that they've stored goes back into the atmosphere. And a lot of that is because of the fine woody debris, the branches and the slash that gets left behind. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but the deforestation adds carbon to the atmosphere. I mentioned that humans have reduced global forest cover for the last about 5,000 years, and the estimates are that we have reduced it from 46% to 31%, and that number is still dropping. So the United Nations is the agency that monitors this globally, and every 5 years they come out with a report, and every 5 years we learn that we have less forest cover on the globe than we had in the previous report. I'm particularly interested in not just forest cover, but the type of forest cover we have. So in that last graph, I said we have 31% forest cover. About half of that forest cover has been cut at least once, sometimes 2 or 3 times. So there's very little primary untouched forest left. So if we look at the difference in maybe one of our remarkable old growth forests in the south up here in the top left versus what that forest might look like today, we can imagine the difference in carbon holding in those two forests. So it's not just forest cover, it's what type of forest cover. These are the maps from the US Geological Survey done in 1925. And they estimated in 1620 the coverage of forest in what was going to become the United States. It wasn't at that time. And we can see that they called virgin forest cover back then. And of course, there were native peoples living on the land, and they did cut and clear some wood. They did have an impact on the forest, but the difference is they were not using those forests as a commodity. They were not cutting them for dollars and shipping them off. And the estimates are that about 50% of that forest land was true old growth, never disturbed by humans. But then with the European settlers, of course, the forest became a commodity. and they were cut and they were shipped and they were used for every possible use, but still out west, the forests were fairly intact. And then by 1920, those western forests were being hit pretty hard too. Today, we have only 1% left of our original forests that have not been cut. That's in the east. And in the west, there's about 5% left. Why do we have more old growth forest left in the west? It's really due to the conservation movement. By the time that eastern logging had been finished and then started to move out west, some people woke up and said, no, we've got to save more of it. Not much, only 5%, but more than was saved in the east. So the science has been very interesting in the last, I would say 20 years at most, really in the last 10 years regarding old growth forests and carbon. It was thought in the past that old growth forests were carbon neutral. That means trees grow, they store carbon, but the trees die and they rot away, and it's kind of an even-sum game. That's what people thought. And a lot of the foresters today still think that. But when you read the science, what we're learning is that old growth forests continually accumulate carbon both above ground and below ground. It's counterintuitive, but that's what we're finding. And so the soils will continue to increase in carbon. And part of that is because these trees are continually raining down branches and leaves and logs, and that carbon accumulates in the soil. And the trees may actually be growing faster now because of the carbon dioxide fertilization effect. So as I talk about these studies, you can look at the fine print here, and you can see the studies that I'm referring to. So if you're interested in a particular issue, you can look up those studies. So the older a forest gets, the more carbon it contains. We know that now. There's no doubt about that. And as they get older, they get larger and they contain more carbon. Might be hard to read the fine print here, but this is 0 to 20 years, 20 to 40 years, all the way up to 100 years. Because of this carbon storage of older forests, many people have been starting to say, hey, instead of cutting these forests when they get 60 years old and they're holding this much carbon, why don't we wait and if we have to cut them, which is questionable, but if we have to cut them, what about waiting and cutting them at 80 years? That way we'd have a longer time period for that carbon to be stored in those forests and take it out of the atmosphere. That is called proforestation. It's a new term that's being used to say, hey, we've already got the forests. They're already doing the work of removing carbon from the atmosphere if we let them do it, if we don't cut them down while they're still trying to do their work. A study done in 2018 found that the largest 1% of trees in a forest equaled over 50% of the total carbon containing biomass, right? 1% of the trees contains half of the carbon in the forest because these are the larger trees. And if you go in and you selectively log and say, oh, we're just going to take out the big trees, guess what? You're removing most of the carbon storage. Forests cannot store large amounts of carbon without large trees. The other thing that we've learned is that trees accumulate carbon for as long as they live. And we're more and more research on this. The rate of tree carbon accumulation increases with tree size. So a single big tree can add the same amount of carbon to the forest within a year, holding that carbon in the forest as contained in an entire mid-sized tree. In other words, a mid-sized tree might take 25 or 30 years to grow, depending on the species and where it is. But a single large tree can add that same amount in 1 year. So if you've taken that big tree out, you've really hamstringed the forest. But sadly, the large old trees that are the most important for this carbon sequestration are declining worldwide. And they are declining for many reasons. They are being, the reasons are legion. I mean, I see in my own community, the biggest, oldest trees are taken out because people are afraid they're going to fall on their houses. Or in the I've seen forests with big old trees that are cleared for development. I see the big old trees that are taken out selectively and sold. Some of the large old trees are succumbing to the non-native invasive insects like the emerald ash borer and the woolly adelgid. You add all those up, and Lindenmeyer and team found that globally we're losing our old trees. And this is important not just for carbon, but because these large old trees have structure that supports many other species. They're shelter for a lot of species. I mentioned in the beginning that a lot of the carbon goes down into the soil and is stored in the soil. And we're learning now that a lot of that carbon is contained and shared within the mycorrhizal network in a forest. So the hyphae, the mycelia, they all contain carbon, and they share that carbon far and wide, and other organisms eat that carbon in the form of the mycelia. So this network gets more and more complex as a forest ages. And that's one way that the carbon is increasing in the forest soil. We also know now that if people say periodic cutting is healthy for a forest and it will increase carbon sequestration, that is absolutely not true. Studies have found that no matter what type of thinning or logging, whether it's clear cut or selective logging, all of these are different types of cutting, shelter wood, clear cut, selective. And this is the amount of carbon stored above ground. And look at this red line. This is no management. So no management, meaning no cutting, is going to always store more carbon in a forest than any of the other types of management options or cutting. So again, this is scientific research. So when we take an old forest that's containing large amounts of carbon, both above ground and below ground, and we cut that forest, log it, to use a wood product, much of that carbon returns to the atmosphere. A very small amount may be stored in wood products temporarily, but most of it returns to the atmosphere. And some of that atmospheric carbon is a result of the soil emissions, because when the sunlight hits the soil and the soils dry out, then those mycorrhizal networks die and they release their carbon into the atmosphere, as well as the finer woody debris and the slash removing their, putting their emissions into the atmosphere. as well as what happens at the mill. And that's not even counting the fossil fuel costs for the logging itself, which can be significant. Another very interesting paper, important paper done in 2016, showed that forest harvesting accounts for 85% of the carbon loss from forests each year. So if we criticize the amount of logging or rate of logging, we can be told, oh, but if you don't cut it, it'll burn down and it'll be lost to a fire, or it'll be lost to insects, or it'll be lost to development, or there'll be windstorms. So these researchers added up all those losses from the forest, losses of trees that would release carbon. And yes, they all do release some carbon into the atmosphere, but by far 85% was the carbon loss from harvesting trees. So we have control over this, right? We may not have great control over the insects or the wind or the drought, but we have control over how much is harvested and when, and we can change that if we want to. And we're gonna have to change that if we want to reduce the carbon in the atmosphere. So this is just a summary here of some of the research that I did for my book, Nature's Temples, looking at old growth forests and how they differ from managed forests. And as we've just been talking about, carbon storage is higher in the older forest and lower in the younger managed forests. But there's many other differences as well, having to do with the living creatures in that forest. So this older unmanaged forest doesn't have just more carbon. It has more salamanders. It has more lichens and more different kinds. It has more beetles and more different kinds. It has more fungi and more different kinds, and snails and wildflowers, herbaceous plants. So not just because of carbon, but also because of biodiversity, we need to save these older forests. So it's like 1-2. If we save it for carbon, we're also going to save it for biodiversity. If we save it for biodiversity, we'll also be removing more carbon from the atmosphere. And to wrap up now, you know, so we know these things and science tells us these things, but what do we do about things? What can we do about it? Sometimes it seems so difficult as an individual to make a difference. And so I honor you all for being involved and trying to make a difference as well. In thinking about this, I thought it's not just how we can make a difference individually, but how can we influence the next generation? Because we can save all the forests we want, but if we don't also have another generation behind us that's going to want to save the forest as well, then our work might be lost. So how can we get these young people off of the screens and to care about forests? So when they're our age with the gray hair, that they'll want to be doing something about it. And I think it's just, we have to put them in relation to the forest. We have to get them into the forest for them to love the forest, to want to work to save it. So my idea for how to do that was that if we could have one forest in each county of the US that's protected from logging and open to the public, then that forest is not only going to accumulate carbon, it's not only going to be positive for biodiversity, but it will be a place where these young people can experience an unlogged forest and fall in love with it. And that idea I called the Old Growth Forest Network. One forest in each county that could support forest growth. Right? There's some regions of the US that can't support forest growth, but about 2/3 can. So that's the mission of the Old Growth Forest Network, which is an organization that I started 10 years ago. And we have been Working on this mission, we now have 136 forests in the network in 25 different states. And these forests are all on our website. I invite you to visit it and see where they are, in case you're wondering. And I heard that there's some people online from Washington State tonight, and we're getting ready to dedicate our first forest in Washington State in September. And you can sign up to get on our email list. And as usual, we are supported entirely with donations from individuals and small family foundations that support our work. And we're so grateful for that. We partner and collaborate with other groups to save forests. So part of our work is educating people, and some of the resources that we produce. You can go on our website if you're interested in some of the things I talked about tonight, but you didn't quite write down the reference in time. Most of those are in this publication called Wild Carbon and Wild Forests. But in addition to the education, our mission also gives us an opportunity to speak out for threatened forests. And I'm always involved with these forests that are these older forests that are threatened with being cut down for development. So I'm able to do what I can to try to help save those forests as well. And I think we should all work together on this. I'm so happy to work with the Sierra Club. And I hope you will work with me. You can recommend forests that should be in the network. You can sign up to be a county coordinator. We get a volunteer in each county that helps us find the best forest in their county to be part of the Old Growth Forest Network. Email me if you're interested in that and want to be involved. And that is the end of my presentation tonight. Thank you for the attention. Oh, good, you're all still there. I just see a screen the whole time I'm talking.
Well, thanks, Joan. We have a few questions in the chat, and if anyone else has any questions and they would like to raise their hand, we can see you on the participant list if your hand is raised. But we can start with the chat first, if you're okay with that, Joan.
Mm-hmm.
A question from Mark. So in the maps that you showed of virgin forests, the one from 1620, he was wondering about it not mentioning native open space habitat, which also contributes to carbon sequestration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were, that was a very rough map. I didn't put that together. That was done in 1925. And yeah, it didn't show a lot of the Native American clearings, but there absolutely were some. Yeah.
Our next question is about emerald ash borer and hemlock woody adelgid and neonicotinoids. I don't know if that's anything you know about, but it's how is the biological control of these insects doing, and is that a legitimate use of those pesticides?
So I tend to be anti-insecticides and chemicals, but this is one place where I've made an exception because I've seen these beautiful big old hemlock trees all over these old growth forests dying, and it's heartbreaking. And not just to lose the trees, but to lose the community of organisms that were living on those trees and surrounding those trees. So I'm in favor of using the injectable insecticides on those trees. The people I know that are doing it are being pretty careful about it. And the same with the emerald ash borer. I've seen firsthand these old growth ash trees that are hundreds of years old and gorgeous old trees, and they're just being taken out and they're snapping off. They're a danger too. So these a lot of the natural areas that have the old growth ash, it's very expensive for them. They have to take these trees down if they want to let people into the forest. So again, I'm in favor of treating some of those trees in the natural areas for emerald ash borer. As far as the biological control, some headway on the beetles for the hemlock woolly adelgid, so that's looking kind of positive. So hopefully the insecticide is just a stopgap measure while the beetles can gain in population. But I don't know at all about the biological control of emerald ash borer. I'm not familiar with that or how that's doing. And then there's a question, is there a way to only harvest smaller trees and leave the big ones? Well, the problem is that there's a rotation, right? Those big ones are eventually going to die, and then what's going to replace them if we take the little ones out? I would almost rather see two classes of forests. One of them shouldn't even be called forest. But if logging can't be totally prevented, right, we're going to use some wood and some wood products. I would rather see the forests that we call crop forests, or, you know, woody woody crops, and those we already have plenty of them, right? Just let's keep growing that crop there, and that can be our wood fiber. But these natural forests with the young trees and the middle-aged trees and the old trees, those are the ones that should be left to do their own thing, in my opinion. Thank you for sharing our website, oldgrowthforest.net. How does a forest get into the network? There are none in South Carolina, home of Congaree National Park and Beadler. I am very excited to say that our first South Carolina forest will be dedicated on September 11th. Everyone's invited. If you haven't seen Congaree, it's one of our exceptional eastern old growth forests near Columbia, South Carolina. And yes, so Beadler, I've heard lots about, I haven't seen firsthand yet. I'm hoping to get that in too. So as far as how it gets in a network, we have these county volunteers, as I said, and they're looking around their county for the oldest forests protected from logging, relatively accessible. And they make recommendations. Anyone can nominate a forest, but the county coordinators will go and they will compare them all to see which is the best. And sometimes we have a great forest, but it doesn't have complete protection. And so we work with that ownership to get that forest protected, hopefully. So hopefully, maybe I'll see some Congaree. Oh, thank you. People are thanking me. Thank you. A 600-acre under threat from developers, a Girl Scout camp. In Louisiana, I would love to work with you on that. I don't have time to read all that right now, but please copy it, send it to me in an email. This is exactly what I like to do. I've had an exciting thing happen this week. I got a call out of the blue from a woman who owned 66 acres in Illinois, and it had never been cut. We could look back on the maps from 1871. It had never been cut. She's in her 80s. She wants to make sure that when she passes, this forest won't be cut. So we're now working with the Illinois Natural Areas Program. That's not quite the name of it, but you get the idea. And they're very interested in acquiring it. And they have this great program that if that forest becomes a natural area, the owner will only have to pay $1 per acre per year in property tax on that forest. So these are the things I love to do, to figure out how to save the forest. As far as saving these, somebody commented about saving the hemlock and ash requires massive application of chemicals, which is not good. We're not trying to save all the hemlocks and all the ash trees, and this is not a spraying. These are special trees in special areas, and we're doing it with injection into those particular trees, and those trees are marked in a lot of cases that the soils are tested. So that's what somebody else said. They're not sprayed, they're injected in small amounts. And it's expensive too, those chemicals, very expensive.
Kevin has his hand raised, so if you want to ask your question,
Hi.
Kevin.
Yeah, Kevin Rice here. I'm a refugee from California, just moved to Maryland because of all the fires. And I've had a fair amount of experience with the Sierra forests, and I'm just wondering whether maybe there has to be some context dependency here, because when I first was working with forests, I was totally against any kind of logging. But then there's some work that's been done with a former student of mine, because I was at UC Davis. Former student Eric Knapp worked at the Stanislaus Experimental Forest, and they had maps from back in the 20s where they had actual forest structure. The guy who did this is a forester who's totally OC. He mapped everything: trees, saplings, underbrush, herb layers, and all. And the forest was incredibly different from what we have now because of fire suppression. So what's happened is we've basically had an impact on the forest structure by doing nothing, or by suppressing the fires. So I never thought I would get involved with this, but I've become fairly convinced, and I think that the science is there, that in these more xeric forest types, where there's been significant fire suppression and the structure of the forest has changed dramatically, there has to be some sort of variable density thinning in order to reestablish the structure. If you look at the data that was back there in terms of the mapping, and you reconstruct that kind of forest structure, a lot of good stuff happens when you reduce it. Now, we're not taking out all the small trees. And actually, because I'm a big fan of the 30-inch dBH limit, you can actually do these kinds of variable density thinnings with maintaining big trees. But what you do is you do a sort of a patchy structure. So I'm just wondering, the idea that, back here in Maryland now, where it's all wet and everything rots, and it's fantastic. I mean, yeah, this is a good thing. But back in California, in some of these xeric forests, the material, when it drops down on the ground, it just sits there, and it is what's resulting in these really large fires, in addition to climate change. But it's one of the things that's contributing to these large fires. So I wish I could say that I agree with no logging, but I think it's very much context dependent. Mm-hmm. Anyway, but great talk.
Kevin, have you read Smokescreen yet by Chad Hansen? Have you? I can't hear you. He's muted. You're muted. You haven't read it?
So Chad Hansen and I have had a very vigorous debate. I will let you know that.
Okay.
And we don't need to get into that because I have some issues with some of his data.
I was
and
just
analysis.
Wondering if you did. I was wondering.
Oh yeah, Chad and I have gone back and forth. But I mean, what I'm saying is that I'm a tree hugger. I love trees, but I've just seen what happens when forests there's been fire suppression for so many years that now John Muir would be amazed at what a lot of the forests look like now. They're just not what he was used to. So anyway.
Okay, you can remute. Thank you. Yes, there is a lot that's context dependent, but I also use just my own eyes. When I go in, I've been in a lot of old growth forests, both in the West and in the East, and I see the forests that have been left alone, and they look a lot healthier to me just looking than the forests where we're trying to maybe get some value out of them as we thin them. So we all have a lot to learn. Thank you, Gavin. Anybody else?
I think there's a couple more in the chat. I don't know if you see them.
Okay. I see one. Yeah, Mendocino County, we have a 50,000 acre public forest. Mandate is timber harvesting. We want to change that mandate, something more ecologically appropriate. Is this something your network might help you with? Yes and no. Yes, we would help you in the form of encouragement, and we would help you in the form of letting you know our experience and what other places have done. But we can't really lead the way on that because we're a small organization and we're covering the whole country. So it's my dream someday to have like a SWAT team that we can send in and say, okay, you know, you're going to Mendocino County, you're going to spend a year there, you're going to help these people. But right now we can't yet put that much attention in one place, but I encourage that and would love to talk with you about that Mendocino County Forest.
Did you answer the question from Rick yet about which percentage of existing U.S. forests would you say should be designated as old growth and not logged at all?
That's a great question. Well, I would love to see us just start with the national forests. I'm not sure what percentage that is, but wouldn't it be great if we could, I know some of those areas are more like crop forests, so we can't just say, okay, we'll stop cutting right now. But what I would like to see is this, at least in the national forests, that we stop cutting the mixed native forests that are storing carbon and stop converting those at least to younger forest. I don't have an exact number to give you, but if we could start with that, I think that would make a big difference. Yeah.
I see Drew has his hand raised.
And Mark also.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, could you unmute Mark inland?
You want to,
Just
Mark, you want to go first? I can wait.
Gotta find him on the list.
I was just going to make a comment supporting what you were saying, that I don't think we as humans really know how to manage forests particularly well. And so if we let nature manage the forest, and I'm concerned when people say, well, things on the ground or we've suppressed fires, so therefore we have to go in and fix that. Well, we already messed it up with what we did. So how are we, you know, that's not really a good argument for why humans should now go in and try to fix something that they already messed up. I mean, we really ultimately want to let forests manage themselves, and then, you know, forests will pick the best solution. So I agree with your, basically what you're saying, and that's
thank you. Yeah, thank you, Drew. As a biologist, you know, you look at all those millions of years of forest evolution and that the forest has figured it out. And I tend to agree with you. If you leave the forest alone, it'll figure it out. Caroline or Mark, who's next?
Was it Mark from Vermont that you saw the hand raised? Mark, you can unmute if that's you. If it was other Mark, you can also unmute. Mark, you can unmute if you would like.
It's not me, must be a different Mark.
Okay.
There we are. Okay, when I was natural resource manager of the Army National Guard 2 decades ago, in 1 year I completely stopped all these horrible forest fires, all of them, by all across the 54 states and territories, all our bases where fire was natural. We had prescribed burns, carefully done in the mosaic patterns at the right time of year and all that, when it was appropriate for the wildlife, plants and birds and so forth. And my colleagues in the Department of Interior were so envious of me. They said, Mark, we can't do it like you because the public complains. So anyway, I just want to say that it's very important that we go back to very careful prescribed burns, which is the natural thing to do, and then you won't have those horrible forest fires. Pretty much. Mm-hmm.
Caroline, looks like you have your hand up.
Hi, it's Carolyn from St. Louis, Missouri, and from the Forest and Climate Grassroots Network. I just love your idea about protecting old growth or mature forests and thinking of them holistically. I love that. I want to, though, speak up for what we call working forests, which are forests that are managed for timber. I'm not suggesting there isn't value in a separation there by any means, but you can most working forests can way that provides some ecological services, provides basic wildlife habitat, protects the watershed, and has some structural diversity. So I just wanted to speak up for the fact that even though you might be growing, quote, a crop of trees, there's not a way that you can do that better as opposed to worse and still get some environmental values.
Can I respond that the Nature Conservancy in the past, many times they could not acquire land to protect it unless they allowed a certain amount of logging. So they have secret ways of doing it properly that worked out. And you got your mature forest and you kept all your, the certain trees at a certain age were harvested as long as you left enough of that species of tree to continue for it to play its role. So if we can look at the Nature Conservancy as a model of how you can do it if you have to do it, only if you have to do it.
And, you know, I invite you to take a step back. A lot of times people get triggered when you talk about not cutting forests because we're just so used to that's the way we do it and that's where income comes from. But with the Old Growth Forest Network, we're saying, let's just leave at least one forest unlogged in every county so that people can see, so that even the scientists can see. They're always complaining we don't have anything no controls to compare what we're doing with. So we need to have not every forest left alone, but certainly more, so we can see what they're like, so places for carbon, habitat, children, and scientists. And we know that they improve the air quality and the water quality. And yes, we'll probably need working forests, and I'd rather have a working forest on the landscape than no working forest. But when you actually look at the science, like in my book, Nature's Temples, you'll see that these working forests are depauperate in so many ways, as far as things that aren't immediately obvious to us, like the wildlife values. So we need a little more, and we need to know where they are so we can get to them and visit them and experience them.
Well, Joan, thank you so much for participating in this wonderful presentation. I think we had vigorous discussion, which was very helpful. And we are done for tonight. I wanted to remind everyone the next third Tuesday of September, Chad Hansen, who is on the executive board of the Sierra Club, will be discussing his book, which was mentioned earlier. So thank you so much, Joan, for being our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Janet.
You're welcome.
I hope to connect with you all. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
Good night.